we have heard quite a bit about socialism on the news over the past couple of years. I noticed that almost never were the conversations about socialism being held by people who identified as socialists or had a passable idea of what the concept even was, let alone how it would be applied to the United States. But we hope to change that with this conversation, where we're joined by the founder and editor-in-chief of Current Affairs and the author of Why You Should Be a Socialist, Nathan J. Robinson. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Hello, nice to be with you, thank you.
Very glad to have you here. There's multiple things that we want to talk to you about, but why don't we start with Current Affairs. When you started Current Affairs, you wanted to have a magazine that approached politics from a leftist point of view. So talk to us about that beginning, how things have developed over time.
Oh yeah, well, we are a print magazine based in New Orleans, and we started with a small crowdfunding campaign in 2015. And we, in 2016, we published an article suggesting that if Bernie Sanders wasn't nominated, Trump would be president, and that got us a lot of subscriptions. And since then, we have sort of built up, and we're part of a new wave of left media institutions. I was inspired by Jacobin, but there are all these wonderful podcasts and magazines and websites that are all springing up that are sort of part of the young left.
And so there's so much that I want to talk to you about, but you've talked a little bit about some of the new infrastructure that's around as an alternative to. In my intro, I was alluding to like when MSNBC would talk about socialism. They like I said, you never have a socialist on to talk about that.
No.
What do you think about the current status of the conversation around socialism? How much people out there actually know about what it represents? The way that it's pitched by the media. What do you think about all of that?
Well, I mean, I think so. It's true that you won't see a self-identified socialist on MSNBC much, but things have changed a lot, right? I mean, the fact that the majority of young people are sympathetic to that label of socialism, the fact that I was able to put out a book called Why You Should Be a Socialist with a mainstream publisher when previously that sort of thing would have been confined to the radical left press. I mean, the fact that Bernie Sanders, after many years as a fringe independent, is now a major contender for the Democratic presidential nomination. All of this represents the mainstreaming of the concept of socialism. Now, whether the concept of socialism is any more clarified, but I argue in the book that I think when young people say they identify with socialism, they are identifying with a particular set of political instincts and placing themselves in a particular political tradition.
So that's interesting. So let's get into the book. So first of all, when a host on MSNBC will ask Bernie Sanders, like they did in 2016, they are now, saying, you identify as a socialist, isn't that gonna make it harder to get elected? What do you think they mean by that label? And when you use the term, what do you mean? When you're saying why people should be socialists, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I think the distorted understanding of socialism is that it's central planning of the economy. That's what you see in Rand Paul's new book, The Case Against Socialism. He says it's government control of production. That's what a socialized economy is. But that's really not a helpful definition of socialism, because the socialist political tradition has always had a lot of people who are anarchists who hate the government in it. It's had lots and lots of different ideas of what a socialized economy would be like. But the place that all socialists do begin, the understanding that I think that they share, is opposition to class division in society, and particularly the division between having a class of people who owns and a class of people who works and sells their labor. And economic socialism has always begun from the principle that workers ought to be the ones who own their factories. There ought to be democratic workplaces. Now, that's not the same thing as government ownership, because you can have a very undemocratic kind of government. But the thing that socialists have always looked at, it really has been based of inequality, and not just inequality of wealth, but inequality of power. And that's one reason that socialism and feminism, socialism and anti-racism are compatible, because socialists have always disliked the radically unequal distribution of power.
Yeah, when you described Rand Paul in particular there, it sounds like he's just using the word socialism, but what he means is examples from the last 70 or so years of communism, effectively. He's not talking about current, Western countries that have democratic socialist governments or parties or policies. No. Okay, so let's focus more on your book. So I know you don't want to give it all away, you want people to read the book, but why should people be socialists?
Well, people should be socialists because the socialists have been on the right side of history before and are on the right side of history now. In fact, I talk a lot about the American tradition of socialism. And if you look at socialists in the United States, it's not gulags, it's not persecution. In fact, socialists have been the foremost champions of civil liberties. They have been the ones who have opposed our unjust wars. I look back to Eugene Debs, whose opposition to World War I landed him in prison. To Martin Luther King, who described his vision for a more socialized society. People like Albert Einstein, people like Helen Keller. They have been the sort of the great minds of this country, and they have been the great prophets of justice. And when socialists have gotten into government here, they've done very well. They've done good things. Socialists passed lots of workplace safety regulation. When Bernie Sanders was the socialist mayor of Vermont, he did a great job. There was a socialist mayor of Milwaukee for 24 years who was voted one of the best mayors in the country. Socialists in America have done a really, really good job whenever they've been in government. And so that's why people should join that political tradition and look back to those heroes and seek inspiration from them.
And as you alluded to earlier, it does seem like a lot of young Americans they're not accepting the framing of socialism that Fox News wants. So do you think that the stigma that remains is every year, is it getting a little bit better? Are we moving past those historical examples and focusing more on what socialism can do in particular in America in the future, as you sort of sketched out? Are you not worried about stigma in future elections?
Well, it's worrying in that a lot of demonization of socialism persists, and of course is often very scary, right? I mean, the conclusion of books like Rand Paul's is like, the socialists pose a threat. We need to stop this threat at all costs. So if people who think that way are in power, then it's very, very dangerous for people who identify as socialists. But generally, the trend has been very promising. I mean, Bernie Sanders has really normalized the label, and I find that lots more people are coming to accept it. Lots more people are getting curious about the socialist tradition. We have people who are conservatives who read current affairs and go, I disagree with some of what you say, but I at least accept that you are worth having a conversation with. And in fact, the book is kind of written for people who are skeptics of socialism, so that hopefully at the end, even if they don't come away as full-blown socialists, they come away as people who think that the socialist position is legitimate and that it should be a major part of the political conversation.
Yeah. And look, I know some of the people who are opposed to socialism, they don't support Bernie Sanders. They're worried about the stakes. They think, well, Donald Trump is so bad. Yep. I mean, if we nominate someone who has this albatross around their neck, they could potentially lose. What I find interesting about that is that I just today read an article on the Daily Beast about how Donald Trump is worried against running someone championing socialist policies. I wrote an op-ed for The Hill making that case several months ago. Yeah. Donald Trump is pitching himself as a populist, I would say a fake populist. Do you think that it is in fact a socialist who is best suited to run against someone like Donald Trump?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can really see from that report that came out about Donald Trump that Donald Trump doesn't really know how to run against Bernie Sanders. He says Bernie Sanders, well, he just says he's crazy, right? But of course, Bernie Sanders has a very good response, which is, well, is it crazy to believe in universal health care? Is it crazy to believe in justice in the workplace? Is it crazy to believe in universal childcare, et cetera, et cetera? It's Donald Trump runs against the Democratic establishment, right? Which is, I mean, he runs against those who are in the pocket of Wall Street. He runs against those who have been responsible for America's unjust wars, those who have been corrupt. And Bernie Sanders isn't associated with any of that. He's in fact been running against those things himself, but he's an authentic populist. He really actually wants to deliver for the people. He's not going to put people like Betsy DeVos and Steve Mnuchin in his cabinet, right? And so I think when you see the real genuine article, someone who is actually representing the interests of the people versus Donald Trump, his phony populism is finally going to be exposed, and my suspicion is that it would completely crumble.
Mm-hmm. So look, obviously you've started a magazine, you've got a book, you're doing all of this to persuade people of your political beliefs, your political values. The media landscape can be very difficult. So I'm curious, along the way, what have you learned about generating an audience, existing in a niche, gaining credibility, those sorts of things? What are some of the lessons that you've learned along the way?
Well, one thing that we've learned is that media can be more viable than people think. I mean, it's true that it's a bleak landscape with all the journalistic layoffs. But if you produce something that is really good quality and, as you say, has an audience who really likes it, and like who's supposed to read this thing. I mean, I always try and think like, is the reader enjoying themselves? Am I making politics feel like eating your vegetables, or is this a magazine that is a pleasure to read? Jacobin and then us have made print media work in a time when people say that print is dead. I think it really is a matter of, and it's not about marketing. We haven't done any advertising and we have no advertisers. It really is, we're completely sort of crowdfunded by our subscribers. Crowdfunding is great. A lot of people have found a way to make a living that way. And we've managed to build a sustainable enterprise by keeping our costs low, keeping our quality high, and really caring a lot about our audience.
So whenever I do an interview like this, obviously I want the audience to learn something, but I too want to learn something. So, I'm a host on the Young Turks. We're a left media organization. I would love to see more socialists on shows like ours, but also on mainstream media channels, things like that. As a proponent for these sorts of things, what are some of the topics you'd like to see discussed more often on shows like ours or on CNN, MSNBC? Who are some of the voices, the writers that you would like to see featured more, their perspectives featured more?
Gosh. Well, I mean, I don't want to go the Young Turks. I mean, you're the last people that I need to be instructing on how to build good progressive media. There's an appendix in the book that has dozens of writers and commentators that I think need to be heard from more, and lots of great little media outlets. So, I mean, instead of just going through a list of names, I would refer people to this long appendix where I compiled all of the names of people. The few big issues that get undercovered are, of course, labor, climate, and nuclear proliferation and war. Right? These are the things that get so little attention or are talked about in bad ways. Sometimes things get sufficient attention, but they're talked about in the wrong ways, like talking about whether the US's strategy in the Middle East is serving its interest versus whether it's legitimate for us to even pursue those interests in that same way. So I think part of it is about covering things more and getting the right people on it, and part of it is about changing the way we talk about things and drawing more attention to the actual human consequences of everything we discuss. So when we discuss Trump, discuss who his policies affect, not just the personal drama and whatever he tweeted yesterday.
Yeah. Nathan Robinson, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like I learned a lot. The book is Why You Should Be a Socialist. The magazine is Current Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us on the conversation today.
Hey, thanks very much for having me on.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below. Then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.